Do what? Can you see me? Yeah. Hi. I think I can see me around here. Just waiting on my other guest to join. Okay.
Hello.
I was just gonna give it a few seconds so more people can join in, and then I'll do the introduction. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I am Sparkle Johnson. I am a Wayne State MSW student interning with the Enough Initiative. Tonight, we will be discussing traumatic brain injury and domestic violence. We are joined tonight by Katherine Snedaker. I'm sorry, I don't want to pronounce your name. My apology. And Dr. Eva Valera. Katherine is the executive director and founder of Pink Concussions, a nonprofit organization focused on female brain injury, including concussions for sports, violence, accidents, and military service. She earned her master's in social work from Fordham University. And in 2013, Katherine founded Pink Concussion as a website summarizing all the research on female concussions. In 2016, she brought together top experts in the field and produced the first international summit of female concussions and TBIs. Dr. Eva Valera is an assistant professor in psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and a research scientist at Massachusetts General Hospital. She has been working in the field of domestic violence for nearly 25 years. Her current work ranges from methodologies to understand the neuropsychological and these words, they always get me, psychological consequences of traumatic brain injuries resulting from intimate partner violence. Her work is ongoing and expanding to address other potential neural consequences of TBIs from partner violence. Tonight, our host, Nicole Beverly, a domestic violence survivor, psychotherapist, and co-founder and president of the Enough Initiative, will discuss the effects that concussions may have on victims for life. It is estimated that 81% of victims have sustained at least one concussion. Many of these concussions go unreported, which create limits in research. The studies that are available have been reported to show that repeated brain injuries are cumulative and not unlike those experienced by athletes. I'm going to pass it over to Nicole so that we can start the interview. Thank you for joining us, ladies.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Hi, guys.
Hi.
Hello.
Good evening.
Okay, or to my speakers back on. Thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate having you both here. For anyone just joining tonight, we are talking about traumatic brain injury and domestic violence, something that we are learning more about, but is definitely not talked about enough, or, as you'll learn tonight, not much research has been done on the topic. But these two ladies here have been doing amazing work. And I'm so honored to have both of you on this evening. And I was telling my interns that if you were to ask anyone in the field who the experts are on this work, it would be you guys. So I'm so honored to have you on. And when I and when I learned about the work you were doing, through a third party, I was so happy, because I was like, oh my gosh, someone is actually doing this research and this work, and I didn't know. So I was so excited to hear about the work you're doing, and I'm so excited to share with other victims and survivors who are watching tonight, who may have, there's some comments popping up, who may be wondering, because I've been doing some promotion, if they themselves have a brain injury and what that looks like. I'm going to start just by asking you guys a few questions. If people, anyone watching has questions, please feel to put them in the comments, and I can read them as we go. One of the first questions that I have for both of you is, what got you interested in doing this work, brain injury, and also the specific research related to domestic violence?
Who wants to go first?
You predate me.
Oh. Oh, you're trying to say I'm older? Oh, so thanks for having me. I'm always happy to talk
tell
about
people that Eve and I are really good friends. So our informal nature is based on a mutual respect and friendship that you might not always have speakers that are buddies, but
yes,
highest respect for Eve.
So the feeling's mutual. So thanks so much for having me and us. And I always think it's a great idea to raise awareness about this and to let people know that this is a real possibility in any situation where intimate partner violence or physical and partner violence has occurred. I got into this because I was doing work in graduate school. When I went to graduate school, I was interested in domestic violence more generally, and Henry, I was actually taking a child abuse prevention course, and then I was volunteering at a women's shelter. And my coursework was in clinical neuropsychology, so understanding brain behavior relationships, what happens if you sustain a brain injury, what are the types of things that you may experience, surprisingly, some people don't realize, you might get depressed or anxious, and that's really, a result of a brain injury, not just you're bummed out. I mean, you could, it's just physiological reasons. And so I'm learning a lot about what's going on in the brain and how injuries to it can manifest in real life situations. And then as I'm working with the women and I hear about what they've gone through, the experiences they've had, if they've had their head smashed against a window, or they're thrown out a window, or have refrigerators thrown on them. I mean, all these things that are just like you think, wow. And if you think about it, and then they start talking about the type of issues that they have, they may be depressed or anxious, or they have problems concentrating or thinking, and so I realized that these women were reporting a lot of the same symptoms that individuals who sustain brain injuries report. And so I literally went to the library and said, what do we know about this? Women, in partner violence and brain injuries, what do we know? And there wasn't anything out there. There's nobody who had looked at this at all. It turns out there was another one or two women who were looking at this concurrently with me in the end, but there was nothing published at the time. So anyway, so I just basically said, well, I want to do this for my dissertation. So for it's since I was already working in the shelter, I had a rapport with women. They kind of trusted me. The staff trusted me, so I was able to, basically carry out my work. And I basically, in the end, from that study, determined that, at least in the women that I had interviewed, it was 99 women. Some were from the shelter, and others were from other programs. or in the community. 3/4 of them reported at least one traumatic brain injury sustained from their partner, and half of them reported repetitive brain injuries from their partners. So, and not only that, but the number, recency, and severity of the brain injuries was associated with cognitive and psychological functioning, such that the more brain injuries you had, the more difficulty you had learning and remembering a list of words, and also switching back and forth from a cognitive task. And also the more you're more likely to have higher ratings of depression, anxiety, worry, PTSD, symptomatology. So I realized, this is a real thing. And, from there, I, just determined that I was going to have to try to figure out more what was going on. And so, now I've done more work in the area, but that's kind of how I got started.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
And then I was working in youth sports concussion, and the field was about 2009, 2011, 10, 11, 12, and it was getting really crowded with people doing sports concussion. And I noticed that the girls, the parents of female athletes, come after the girls have been injured for like 3 weeks to a month to 6 weeks. And literally, I have 3 boys, and I kind of just thought the parents of girls were just kind of irresponsible. I just couldn't understand this pattern. And it was happening enough that I decided to look into the research. So I looked into the research, and I found that sex differences in sports concussion, which is usually where most of the first brain injury concussion research comes from, is the sports world. And it, like 1999, 2001, 2002, 2003, Tracy Pavosson had really found and written about on multiple times the differences between men and women athletes, and that women concuss at a higher rate than men. Men overall have more concussions, but if you do sport like soccer, it's the same rules. Women concuss at a higher rate. Women tend to have more symptoms, more severe symptoms, and take longer to recover. So I took that on and created Pink Concussions, and I'd had a number of concussions over the years, and I had two circumstances where I went to the ER with things that I had done that were not violence. But one time I went with a boyfriend, and they took him out of the room and asked him if he had hit me. Another time I came in by myself, where a flashlight had hit me in the forehead and split my temple, and they were convinced somebody had done it to me. So that connection between brain injury and domestic violence as a source was something that I had actually experienced in the ER, but I didn't see it replicated out in the research. So when I had this first conference, I wanted to do domestic violence, military service, and sports all together. And I was tracking down someone named Amy Wagner that had really talked about this topic about 15 years ago, but really hadn't done anything since. And I didn't know Eve then. It would have been so much easier had I found Eve then. But it was interesting. I got a real pushback from the sports doc people going, you know what, let's just not use domestic violence. Let's just stick with the sports. It's a lot of a happier topic. And the more I got pushed back of not talking about domestic violence, which was in the tagline of our organization, as a source of brain injury for women, the more it just made me want to do it. So all of our events, I've never run an event without domestic violence as a topic. And I have found Eve, and Eve has presented on multiple events. And now we have a domestic violence task force together. We have a monthly call with about 230 members now across 12 countries. So, mine came from the sports world, but mine was more of the advocacy, that pushing the topic out. Yeah, people don't want to talk about it, but it's essential that we do. And Eve has a great slide where she talks about all the energy we put into sports concussions. But if you compare that to the number of women that have brain injuries from domestic violence, it's a tenfold. Eve, that's your stat?
I don't know the exact numbers. I mean, it depends on what you're measuring, but it's not even close. I mean, we don't have good estimates for IPV related TBI, right? I mean, we have some things that we can extrapolate from, but it's just not even close. It's just like, if you talk about the NFL, there may be several hundred people, right? I mean, there's not that many at all, and there's tons of research for NFL players, and then, I mean, if you do it more globally to athletics. I mean, even it's just there are millions of women that are likely walking around with undiagnosed, unrecognized brain injuries from their partners.
And actually, that was one of my questions that I was going to ask you guys. You know, I think everyone who knows me and watches my lives knows my answer to this question. What I'm going to ask you, pose this to you. Why do you think, you know, there's such a lack of interest and research being done on victims of domestic violence compared to NFL, military, especially because they're kind of the hot groups right now that are being studied. So in your opinion, why do you think domestic violence isn't looked at when we know the numbers are probably higher than, you know, the other categories? What are your thoughts?
Money.
Well, I think there's a number of reasons, in my opinion. And again, I mean, do we really know? I don't know, but I think, you know, you could just look at misogyny first of all, or just sort of there's institutional racism and there's institutional genderism as too. In any type of science, anything that you're looking at, males are disproportionately studied. It doesn't matter. And in the animal world, in the human world, and NIH had to have an initiative to study females, like a number of years back. Like, oh, we got to like, gee, oh, why would we do that? So one of it is just women are not as valued in society as men are, and so women's problems are going to be less likely to be looked at. There's also, I mean, and there's a whole host of other ideas. And it's also, you know, part of it is like, oh, it's a misperception of who, you know, battered women are, or these women who are in partner violence situations. There's not that many of these women anyway, or they're all, you know, those poor people over there who don't really care about that much anyway. How much money do we devote to homelessness, or, you know, things that are of a lower SES problem? Very little, really. I mean, it's I think there's just a lot of biases in who gets studied and how. And then, I mean, there is the element of, you know, if you're a survivor, you may not be so trusting of scientists and stuff, or you know, certainly who may largely be males doing work. So you know, getting women to participate may be challenging. But you know, honestly, in almost any, so there's so many different types of scenarios where it's not that easy to get people to participate. So I really don't buy that that's really the issue, because I've been successful in doing it. And then I just think that largely it's men tend to get studied more, men are appreciated more, and people don't think of partner violence as, and some people think, oh, that's, you know, that's her problem, she should just get out of the relationship, why should we worry about that? Which to me makes no sense if that's true, because football players are signing up to play football, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so I don't, you know, that's just my theorizing. We don't have studies. I mean, I don't know how we would ever find out for real. But those are the types of things that I suspect have played into this issue. One thing that's kind of interesting is I think more recently, maybe even since COVID, there may have been a few more people who are interested in doing IPV work. And it may be in part because, as Katherine was saying, money. You can't necessarily do research, or as much research in athletics right now, because there's not athletics going on in some places. You know, if your population is drying up because of COVID, you're going, oh, well, let's jump on this bandwagon. I don't know. That's being a little pessimistic, but I don't know.
Well,
so, yeah,
pretty much everything you said is what I would have said too. You just said it in a much more eloquent way than I would. But pretty much the same thing I would have said. And I'm hopeful, and Katherine, we've talked about this too, that maybe if anything good comes out of COVID is that it can kind of push the focus onto victims of domestic violence, because we're seeing such an increase. Katherine, is there anything else that you feel?
Can I share a screen with that sort of thing?
Do you see, is that an option for you down at the bottom?
Yes. Let me just see if I messed up here.
Let me see if I have to give you a control, if it's like Zoom or not like Zoom.
I've got it. I just wanted to show you.
Cool.
You see that? This is a great paper. It's called the Fighter and the Punch Drunk Wife. And
Oh,
this
that
is the history of brain injury research. And you can see in 1890 railroad injuries, the spike is how many articles were published. So there's real interest in brain injury around the railroad injury types. And then World War One, and then World War Two, and then safety and automobiles and boxing, which sports, which led to contact sports. So they're really male-oriented sports um, that were the catalyst for this. So if you're a guy, if you're a male doctor, because generally they're male doctors at the time, and you wanted to study brain injury, where are you going to find a bunch of brain injured people? Well, a football field. So the brain injury has been the lab. Football has been the lab rats for the doctors. So the doctors needed the football players because they needed brain injury subjects. You can't go into a lab and smack somebody in the head. So the football doctors, brain injury have been cyclical back and forth, supporting each other with money and funding, since the 1900s. So that is a really enmeshed system. So to try to break free from that and have interest in women, when Tracy Kavassen did this work on women in 2003, 2004, it just was a tiny byline. People weren't interested. But as more women with Title 19 became into sports, then there was more interest, and as those women became professional athletes, we value our athletes. So if they have a brain injury, and sports has this idea where they call it, someone had asked about concussion. Concussion was a word that can be used to kind of take the focus off that it is a brain injury. And now sports-related concussions are called SRCs, sports-related concussions, which is the next level down of taking it away from actual brain injury. So the sports and the military have been enmeshed for years around brain injury. And I think as women becoming part of the military and have become part of sports, then we've had to look at them as, more of the guinea pig stuff.
Okay, and go ahead.
I was going to say, I still don't think it's representative. I mean, there's no excuse for studying male animals.
So right now, the NCAA study is studying men and women, and I think they looked at. I think at the time they 25,000 students, and they're studying males and females. They're all getting MRIs. They're all getting blood work. They're getting the same workups. And since the day that they announced this, I have been pushing them, having phone calls, and annoying basically them as I speak across the world with the same doctors, that they're not studying the unique factors that make women different. They're not looking at female hormones. They're not looking at they're not looking at the things that make us different and our estrogen. And so it's harder to study female animals. What they found out when they were looking at lab animals, they found out that the female rats, the menstrual cycle threw off the results. So when the female lab rat was injured in a certain part of her menstrual cycle, she had a poorer or healthier outcome. Well, that's kind of messy if you're a doctor. It's like, oh, that's too many variables. So sex differences were seen as a roadblock, not as a biological variable that should be studied. So that's why they did all the study on male rats. And then if they went out to the football field, there were all males out there. So even though women are included in studies, they're still not studying the aspects about us that make us different. And I've argued back and forth with the doctors in charge, and they're like, yeah, but that's too many variables. So we're getting there. We're in the studies, but we need the studies to push forward and study the aspects about women that make us unique.
Yeah, well, an interesting tidbit is that men also have hormonal cycles. So it's not just, again, I think there are excuses for why women aren't studied. And maybe I actually have to look at this. Maybe I'll ask Jeff Bazarian, because he's the one who did the study you're talking about, Katherine. But I mean, men cycle as well in terms of their hormones. And so it's not just that, the men are like nice and stable, so they're easy. So maybe women are a little more difficult. I'm not even sure if that's true. But I think there's this sort of innate whatever. I mean, I just think I think that women are just less valued. I don't think people want to take the extra step to figure out the menstrual cycle. But you're absolutely correct that that has been a reason why mice are or rats or animals may not female mice may not be used, because depending on where they are, you're going to potentially get a different effect, and that will muddy the waters.
Mm-hmm.
So the answer is just throw them out of research. Don't try to figure it out.
So if somebody is watching right now and they have been a victim of domestic violence, and they've either had blunt force trauma to the head from a punch or a kick, or being pushed against something and hit their head, or even we'll talk about strangulation in a minute. But if someone is listening and wondering, what are the common symptoms that someone experiences when they have sustained a brain injury? And whoever wants to go first. Do you want me to start saying who, and then you guys? It'll be easier.
Yeah, you can
We'll have you go first on that one.
All right. So interestingly, some of the same symptoms that we would see for somebody who has sustained a brain injury are the symptoms that you might see if you're really stressed out. So in a psychologically or stressful or abusive relationship. So in fact, I mean, that's what people were assuming, was that women, we've known for, I mean, we, the field, whoever has known for years, going way back, that women, battered women, or women who have experienced intimate partner violence, may be more likely to be depressed, anxious, confused, irritable, have sleep problems, all these things. But if you think about that, you know, and they were just saying, oh, that's because people are in a psychologically, you know, stressful, abusive relationship. And then that's where I said, well, I think there's more here. And then lo and behold, yeah, it's brain injuries. So it's similar. One thing I think that Katherine and others have talked a lot about is that there's a large overlap between PTSD symptomatology and brain injury as well. So there are. So I just want to mention that, just so that people think, oh, I have that, so that means I must have a brain injury, because there are overlaps. But what has overwhelmingly happened, I think, is that people have just been assumed to have psychological distress or psychological trauma, which is serious. I don't want to minimize that by any means. But that means they may not get the right treatment, or they might not approach the situation in the way that they should, or they may not have that information to know that I shouldn't be sustaining another brain injury, because if I sustain another one, I just had one last week, I'm really going to be in big trouble. But some of the things that you might have are some of the things that we've talked about. So people who may have attentional problems, not focusing, difficulty focusing. Maybe you might be highly irritable at times. I mean, there's a whole range of what we call
word retrieval.
Yep, it could be word retrieval. And then, you know, people's sleep problems are a big one. But when I look, I mean, and you know, there's definitely women who they're reporting higher rates of depression or anxiety. And what's interesting is that you know, the idea that it could be because you're in that relationship, and you know, you're like walking on pins and needles, you never know if you're going to get slugged or whatever, and that may be true, you know, and that's reasonable to say, yeah, you might be depressed or worried or anxious. But you know, I've spoken to women who are many years out of their relationships now, and they still have a lot of these problems. And so it's not the psychological, you know, so now they should be recovered, you know, but they're not. And part of it is, from what I assume, and what seems to be the case, is that part of that is long-term effects of repetitive brain injuries that, you know, linger and may persist, and maybe even get exacerbated with age.
Marcy's asking about the timing of those symptoms, and I think that's important, because the symptoms can come out immediately. Or, I mean, if you think from a sports example, plenty of girls who I've worked with that have had a concussion on the field, finished the game, you know, celebrated with their team, and then driving home threw up 6 times and could barely get into the house. You know, people that have had concussions, you know, and they wake up the next day. I mean, it's a 72-hour period where those symptoms can come out, which is one of the reasons why, you know, they said, when in doubt, sit it out. And we try to keep athletes out for 24 hours. And I think that just from a male female perspective, I think when females come in with pain, it's thought of in the past as psychological. What's wrong with you psychologically? Let's go through the psychological files, and then if we can't find a psychological reason, then we'll look for the physical, which I think is that opposite for the men. If the men present pain, it's what's physically wrong with you, and if we can't find anything, then it's psychological. So I think there's these different lenses. And this paper from the slide that I showed you talked about how they found a woman in 1990 who had been beaten to death, and she had cauliflower ears like a boxer because she had been repeatedly hit. And they were doing a boxer study. So they examined her brain because she had elements of her face that was scarred like a boxer. But that didn't become the first Mike Webster, the football guy that broke open the whole NFL thing. I mean, it was just like, oh, wow, you hit a woman repeatedly. It looks like, and it was a term that they used, punch drunk at the time, which was predates at that point some of the use of CTE. But again, we're looking at women from a psychological standpoint. What's psychologically wrong with you? And once we get through all of that, then we'll look at the physical nature of your brain injury. And I think it's important for women to get the care that they need, because a lot of these things that we're talking about actually have, once you're aware of it, you can say to someone, hey, you know what, I can only do a 20-minute interview. 1 hour interview is too long. You know, can I be up against the wall? There's too much noise. Give a private place we can talk. You can advocate for yourself if you know that you get tired, that these distractions are. I mean, even for me, just they're great facts going along the bottom, but mentally I'm having to kind of work through that bottom line.
Mm-hmm.
There are things like that once you're aware of stuff like that. So as much as what we're talking about, I think what Eva and I have found is all the people that we've worked with, that I have not had anybody come to me and say, wow, I wish I didn't know. I wish I didn't find out that I had a brain injury.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
Because once you find out, there are things that you can do to help yourself, interpret your environment in a different way to make day-to-day transactions with other people. And that's what even people in our group have been training people at domestic violence shelters, how maybe they can't get the women to an MRI or a CAT scan or a brain injury clinic, but if they can break down how they do intakes and help women along in these ways, then remind them every morning that they have an appointment. It's just these little pieces of breaking the symptoms down and having ways of attacking each one can improve somebody's quality of life.
Yeah, and I think, as you were saying that, Catherine, I was just thinking, for so many, like, we're so used to our abuser telling us we're crazy, and then healthcare professionals maybe thinking, our symptoms are crazy. So to hear like that is truly what your diagnosis is, and to know that there's accommodations that can help, you in your life is huge, and it can be so valuable. And consistently, as a survivor myself, and knowing so many other survivors, not many people are screening. No one's like even asking the question about like specific injuries to the head or strangulation, at shelters, counseling, therapy, doctor's appointments. Like, it's not even, it's like, I think we're so much in crisis mode with domestic violence. It's like, okay, if you're immediately out of the crisis, get you housing, and we're not looking at, the potential medical component. So I can understand why it would be such a relief for someone to find out, like, there's actually a physiological reason that I'm having these symptoms. It's not all just in my head, or, so I think I could definitely see how that could be life-changing.
And a lot of those strategies are from the ADD world, attention deficit.
Mm-hmm.
So they are available. They've just been created and put together for different groups. So, and I think that it's pretty simple, the type of things that have been taught to shelter staffs, but really have had a great impact of, she keeps forgetting her appointment, not because she doesn't care about the work that you're doing to help her. She has brain injury. She can't remember her appointment. What if you texted her? I know the VA went to a system where they texted everybody the morning of their appointment. Guess what? Everybody showed up. Some of these little things that are possible to do on our smartphones really can change somebody's day-to-day living in compliance to medical care that can help them get better.
Absolutely. Lindsay had a question. I'm pulling it back up. Does traumatic brain injury occur as a result of a concussion, or can it exist without a concussion?
Well, I think that it's kind of a little bit of semantics there, because a concussion is a traumatic brain injury. It's a mild traumatic brain injury, but it's a traumatic brain injury. And so it's, I guess there's not really a way to answer that except to say that they're the same thing. So you could have a traumatic brain injury that's moderate or severe, which means maybe you lost consciousness for more than a half hour, or you had memory loss for more than 24 hours, or you could have a traumatic brain injury that's mild. Most concussions are considered simple, mild traumatic brain injuries, or a simple concussion is a mild traumatic brain injury. And you often don't necessarily, like if you have an MRI or a CAT scan or whatever, typically you won't see anything that looks out of order for a mild, for basically a mild traumatic brain injury or concussion. And so that's why it's really important to understand that, because you may, I mean, I actually fell playing with my kid, and I mean, long story, but my brain looked totally fine, but I definitely had a concussion. No question. And if somebody had said, "Oh, your brain looks," I've heard stories where doctors or somebody, and I'm like, I don't know how this person got their license, whatever, but they'd say, "Oh, your brain looks fine. You don't have a concussion." I'm like, no, that's not true. We don't necessarily have the technology, the capabilities, or the hospitals don't to see the potential damage, which we often call diffuse axonal injury. So it means the axons may be damaged in the brain, which are very, very tiny, and it's kind of all over instead of just one spot. So we don't see like some big concussion, some big contusion, sorry, in the brain, like there's no bleeding, a big spot that you might see. But they do the scans in part to make sure that there isn't anything worse than a concussion. But most people in the medical field will understand, hopefully, that the MRI or the CT scan isn't ruling out a concussion. It's just making sure you don't have anything worse than that. If you get hit in the head and you are kind of confused or disoriented and you don't know what's going on for a minute, that's a concussion. If you lose consciousness even for a second, that's a concussion. And again, if it's from an external trauma to the head, if you pass out from drinking too much, that's not a concussion. That's something else.
That's a whole nother show.
Yeah, but I think some people don't realize just how easily, exactly what a concussion or a mild traumatic brain injury is. So sometimes I don't like to use the word concussion, because I think people realize it's a little more meaningful. But in the past, concussion wasn't necessarily a big deal at all. Mm-hmm. A mild traumatic brain injury meant like, oh, you got a mild traumatic. So, but I actually kind of prefer to use the term mild traumatic brain injury, just mm-hmm. because it's more clearly obvious that, yeah, something has happened and you don't want that to happen again. And you might have symptoms from this that might last. So.
Absolutely. What would you say is from the research that you've done, because you guys are, have done research, you talk to victims, and individuals who have sustained traumatic brain injury, what would you say is the most striking information from your research in terms of relationship to victims of domestic violence? Is there anything that really stands out to you?
Katherine, do you want to go?
Wow, I'm just looking for a slide real quickly. I'll let you jump in.
Okay.
So the question is what's striking about, I'm not sure.
Just research that you've done, is there anything, so far that you were surprised at learning or really felt was like the most valuable outcome so far?
Well, to be totally honest, one of the things that's very surprising to me is how many brain injuries these women sustain. I mean, not everyone, but I mean, when somebody says it's too many to count, or it would happen like whenever he walked, if he was in a bad mood, he'd just walk in and slam my head against the door jamb, and so that might happen a couple times a week for a year or something. I mean, and they're experiencing symptoms after that. I mean, that's you know, it's like wow. I mean, we knew. I mean, I thought I knew that women would be sustaining brain injuries, but then you actually ask them in a way that they can give you the information. Because if you say, "Have you sustained a brain injury?" Then I would say, "I don't think so. I don't know." If you ask it in the right way, you can discover this. And really, it's mind-boggling that women have sustained that many women that I have spoken to have sustained so many brain injuries.
And Eve, I appreciate you saying that so much, because I think if someone working with domestic violence victims, either in the medical or the domestic violence field, ask that question, people who don't know what that is are automatically going to say no. But if you ask it, and for any of my therapists, counselors, people in the medical field watching, I think it's important to ask it in a way where you are giving those more specific examples, so people understand that you can sustain this from a blow to the head, a kick to the head, being pushed, your head into something, which, we know as victims of domestic violence that so often abusers target this area because the bruises and the bumps aren't visible under our hair. So that is a very frequently targeted area by abusers because they're strategic and where they target us. So I think giving victims that example, or giving examples of how it could have occurred, is so powerful, because otherwise they may not have any idea of really that its potential that they have. And Jasmine, I know Katherine, you said, but Jasmine, it's a good question. Is there a way to find out years later if you possibly suffered a TBI? So I know there's probably victims watching or survivors watching who've been out of the relationship for a while, but maybe are recognizing some of the symptoms that you brought up. Is there a way for them to find out that maybe they do or have suffered one or many traumatic brain injury from their abuser?
Well, I mean, what I do when I speak to women is I say, after anything your partner ever did to you, did you ever lose consciousness? And then if they say yes, I find out how that happened. If it was just from some type of blow to the head or violent shaking or strangulation, then that's a brain injury. Okay. If and then I say, after anything your partner ever did to you, did you ever feel really disoriented or confused or not feel quite right? And they say, yeah, then I find out again if it's some type of trauma to the head, then that would be a brain injury. So that you would ask yourself, and then there's a couple of other questions. So really, there's like, if you have confusion, if you have memory loss, if you have, like I said, loss of consciousness, basically some type of alteration in consciousness after your head being struck, or your brain being, subjected to really strong forces, then you've sustained a brain injury. And so that's how you would ask. I mean, now there are situations where I might say, they'll be like, yeah, I was really confused, and and then they say, well, I was, or I didn't remember. I'm like, okay, well, I didn't remember what we were arguing about. And so in that case, I'm like, okay, well, maybe that's not really a brain injury. Maybe they just, forgot what they were arguing about. So there could be situations where it's a little unclear, but certainly if there's a loss of consciousness following a hit to the head, that's a concussion, period. You don't need to know anymore. And I had a woman say, like, I just remember that ring coming at me, and I just wasn't right after that. And that was the best way she could describe it, because she was kind of out of it. And, and then that was a concussion. And then, she reported she had sleep problems. She reported a whole litany of other things, that were very consistent with that. So I guess that's what you would do. You would basically look back and ask those questions. And then, you know, if substances are involved, it may get murkier. But you know, in general, that's how I determine that.
I wanted to go back to one of your question before, which the surprising thing and that I've found in this field, and I have a certain fascination with this. We've had presentations from England and Australia, is the number of women in prison that have had brain injuries. I was just looking up at one study where they in England they looked at 173 people went to women's prison, and 64% of those women, 64% of those 173 had a brain injury. 28% of them did nothing after the brain injury. 72% of them in the general prison survey reported violence as a cause of TBI. 41% reported domestic violence as the cause. 96% of those reported domestic violence history. And I wonder how many women in our prison system are there because of domestic violence, are there because of brain injuries. Also, there's a high number of percentages in our prison systems of men with brain injuries. So how much does brain injury play a role in you have, you know, two people dating with brain injury and how that affects them, and then you have a child born with violence in the household, and the multi-generational issues with brain injury, not as a genetic aspect, but as violence passed down through the generations. So I really hope that prison systems come to have better screenings and more education for women that have that back history, that may get out of prison and not be able to handle you know, a return to civilian life. The other piece of that too is women in the military, female veterans have double the rate of domestic violence as their civilian counterpart. So then you have a system where you have people with PTSD and experiences within the military. So there are certain groups that I don't think we spend enough time and money looking at that are part of subsets of this overall picture.
Yeah, that is very powerful information, and I have never heard those statistics before in terms of the relationship between the brain injury and women in prison. So I know we have a lot of women in prison who are victims of domestic violence, and even, you know, with clear evidence that it was self-defense, they still end up charged, you know, and facing life sentences, but also, you know, for other crimes, but they have been at some point victims of domestic violence in their life. So, but hearing this is, I was not aware of that information, so that's really powerful. We've kind of, you know, one of the questions we were asked were the biggest hurdles, and I think we've kind of addressed that already with the information that we talked about just being able to study anything involving women, you know, and the financial obstacles and all of that. In terms of one of the questions that I've had, and I know you guys can't even really answer this, but I think it's important for us to look at as a possibility, is if victims have a harder time leaving their abuser and their abusive relationships if they have sustained a or multiple brain injuries and are facing, you know, or dealing with some of those symptoms that we mentioned earlier. Does have any thoughts on that possibility? Because I think you know, there's lots of reasons that women stay. We know financial, we know love, fear, family, but, you know, if there could be an additional medical component that could be addressed, it would be, you know, important for us to figure that out with research at some point.
I mean, I would love to see.
I know that
one of the things that you said was, you know, we don't know. And oh, I'm sorry. Did you want to go, Katherine? Were you talking? Okay. We don't have the data on that. I mean, I don't think anyone's actually asked those questions, and I mean, it seems very hard to do. But I firmly believe that if we do or when we do, yeah, we're going to find that does. It certainly can't help. I mean, just think of. I mean, if there are so many different ways that it could make leaving a relationship more difficult. if you think you're incapable of doing things, and there's all this gaslighting going on to begin with, and you're not good enough, and now you have a brain injury, so yeah, you are kind of not as good as maybe you used to be or something. You don't know what's going on. You can't survive on your own, so like you may not even try to leave because you feel so incapable. If you can't hold down a job, if you're financially dependent, so there are different ways. And then if you think of someone who says, I want to leave, but leaving is one of the most dangerous times to leave, either leaving or after you've left. So you have to figure out a plan, that may involve a pet, all your paperwork and stuff, your children, and going to a place where somebody has threatened to kill you and stalk you and whatever. You have to figure that out. It's in a safe way, and you're having problems with initiation or with focusing or with planning. I mean, how on earth is a brain injury going to help that? So I definitely think that if you're suffering brain injuries in this situation, it's going to make it tremendously more difficult to get out. I mean, we don't have the data, but everything that I know tells me that that's, as you were saying, I think it's a very likely scenario.
And one of the anecdotal things that I've read is how credible a witness are you if you are going to the authorities, and you don't remember all the details. It's one of the series of questions they'll ask in sports is, what quarter are we in? What's the other team that we're playing? What's the score? It's basic things, right? And yet, a woman goes to make a report and wants a restraining order and may not know the details. There's a really good training film from Scotland that they're asking this woman who's been traumatized questions like, what time did it happen and what room were you in? And she could remember a ticking clock and a cat walking by. So they were like, what? But the training video was like, when we're in traumatic situations, we don't, even without a brain injury, process all the details around us in the way that one would think. So, if you have a brain injury and you come from a traumatic situation, what hand did he hit you with? I don't know. I mean, you're going to sound like not a very credible witness. And then it's a situation where you're deemed to be on drugs or high, or, what situation do you come into when you deal with authorities to try to get that help?
If you guys hear weird noises, it's my highly anxious pit bull, so don't worry. It's nothing crazy going on. We're trying. She interrupts my work meeting. So she's
okay.
Putting on right now. So yeah, thank you for answering that question, because I think it's so it's so important, in everything that you guys said doesn't surprise me. And you're right. Like, how would we determine that? And with the research, but I'm wondering too, people watching again who were are survivors and maybe recognizing that they left years ago, but they're still having these symptoms even when they're no longer in that acute phase of just leaving and in that emergency situation. Are there resources available, sites, apps that you guys would suggest for them to help them learn those accommodations, those skills for I think you guys mentioned using a planner, setting alarms, having reminders. Are there resources, sites that you guys would recommend that victims, survivors could go to just get more information? Pink Concussions, obviously. Other informative sites that you guys would recommend?
Rachel, who's on our leadership, she's the Ohio Domestic Violence Network. They have some really great printout workbooks. She's put together some great stuff. That the link is on our site for that too. The other thing I did want to mention, as a white woman without the experience, but I wanted to put out there for a woman of color who is in a situation where she is calling for help in a situation, and she's bringing a police officer into her house, which may then put a situation where the person that she's calling on is going to be at risk of being shot. So there are multiple levels when you get into race or same-sex relationships or trans relationships where the puzzle pieces get even more complicated and more pressure, I think, on the victim themselves to try to sort through what's an appropriate response and how to get out of that situation, and how to truly connect with help that is going to get them to a safe space.
Absolutely. And we actually, so it was a week and a half ago, we had a trans expert on, and she talked about a lot of that stuff. And next week, or the 21st, we're doing domestic violence in the Black community too, to kind of like talk about, these issues and how things are different and how things might look different, and how culture and sexuality and income, religion, all those things play a role in this. So absolutely. And we are seeing, and so I love having these open and honest conversations, and just talking about everything and putting everything on the table, because it's so important that we do that when we're looking at, so we have so many obstacles as victims, so many obstacles. And I'm so happy that you guys are doing this work for brain injury, because this is an obstacle that people didn't even know they had, because talking about it. So, it's like, first, we can't address a problem, we can't address an obstacle until we know it's there. So I think that's why it's so important that we're having this conversation too, because people might be listening right now and realizing for the first time ever that this is a possibility. And this is even people who have sustained multiple concussions, multiple blows to the head. And one of my other questions for you guys in terms of strangulation, because we do know a lot of victims of domestic violence are strangled by their partners, and we know that that's the number one predictor for death for domestic violence victims, is if they have, that history of strangulation is there. But maybe if you guys could kind of if there is a simple way to explain how, the strangulation also causes a form of brain injury, I think that could be really powerful too.
So, I mean, really, if you can sustain, basically what would happen is it wouldn't necessarily be a traumatic brain injury, but it's sort of semantics, but be it brain injury. And it could be an ischemic or anoxic, or like you could have damage due to like low oxygen levels, basically because the blood's not getting to the brain, or ischemia where the nutrients aren't getting to the brain either. And you could also have damage to the actual blood vessels where basically there's some damage, and then you may have a piece of the blood vessel actually break off. And so weeks later, you may have a stroke, and it could be from something like that. So like it'd be a carotid dissection. So so that's a different type of brain injury, but like you're basically having vascular injuries. You can have vascular injuries, which could ultimately result in a brain injury. And then if you're not getting enough oxygen to your brain, that can result in brain cell death, or nutrients. You could also have pressure buildup in the brain if you have blood going in but no blood coming out because you have pressure on the right spots. And that's where you might see some of the petechia or some of the redness that occurs, some of the red spots. So there's different ways, and we don't know a lot about that either in terms of what is associated with repetitive strangulations or even one strangulation. So I'm actually working on a paper on that, so hopefully we'll have some data soon. But
okay, awesome. Eve, could you repeat what was the you said something about the red spots? What were those called?
Oh, it's petechia.
Okay, gotcha. So that's something that police officers, nurses, they're all being trained on looking for, correct? As they're supposed to.
So the weird thing about strangulation is you can strangle someone to death and leave no visible marks. That's one of the frightening things about strangulation. If you look at a CT scan or something, may show maybe more likely to show something internal, but you could literally strangle someone to death and have no visible marks. But if there are visible marks, there will often be like some type of red, either red around the neck, maybe she may claw at it, there may be marks back here, maybe bloodshot in the eyes, or like little red dots anywhere above the point of strangulation. You may have like red dots, they may be on the cheek, they may be under here, they may be back here. So those are the types of things that you may see. And then the other thing would be you may have a voice change, and then you may feel nauseous. You may pee your pants or poop your pants. Those are some of the types of things that happen when people are strangled. People don't want to admit to that, but
and there's a huge statistic. I want to say 500% chance of, like, once there's a situation, once there's a, I don't know the specific number, but once there is an incident of strangulation, the likelihood that the subsequent issues could end in the woman's death, it's a very uptick of violence. And strangulation, we have a call on our website. We have a call Jackie Campbell did all on. She's an expert in strangulation, and there's a flyer on that webpage too. It's a whole, strangulation is a whole field within itself.
Absolutely. And would you guys say, you mentioned before, if a victim has sustained blows to the head, lost consciousness, that they can pretty much, they can assume that they have sustained at least one brain injury. Would the same be with strangulation? If they were strangled, choked until they lost consciousness, would they also assume then that they have a brain injury?
I don't know enough about the topic to be able to, and I'm also a social worker, not a medical person, but there's a lot to learn on strangulation. I don't know.
Okay. No, and I appreciate that. Now, Eve, did you want to have anything to add to that?
I interpret it as an alteration in consciousness, and so what I do is I ask those questions after anything your partner ever did to you. Did you ever, for example, lose consciousness? And if it was from being strangled or from some type of blow to the head, I will count that. Now,
Okay.
what we know about strangulation, like I said, I think we don't know enough. It's hard to do studies on it. I think there's more. I mean, there's some experts in the field who I've been trying to reach out to that will understand more. But the data that I have right now does, it's it's not, it's one study, but I'm seeing a relationship between the number of time a woman reported an alteration in consciousness from strangulation and some other stuff. So basically, there probably is something there. But yeah, you're definitely, your brain is getting some type of hits. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And I just want to be clear too, because we've talked a lot about women and brain injury and domestic violence, and we're actually doing a show too about men being victims of domestic violence. And I will say this to men, we know that this happens to you also, and we know it's difficult for men to report, it's difficult for men to come forward and talk about this. But I'm just thinking in my mind, with the combination of the issues with females not we're not being able to do the research because of funding for women, but we do know there are male victims too. So if we could maybe get some male victims to participate in the research and studies, it could be powerful in terms of the funding related to domestic violence too. I just want to throw that out there, because I never want to just anyone to think that we're saying this only happens to women, because we know it happens to men too. And I think perpetrators are perpetrators, and the head is often targeted by any perpetrator. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there, and for men to realize this, they could also not be aware that they have sustained, male victims, these same issues, and not be aware until they're hearing this. So, because we do have quite a few male victims that follow our page too. And I know we're already, it's like these go by so fast. We're already at an hour. So you guys kind of answered. So the accommodations, Pink Concussions is so more people can go for more information to the website. And we'll put that in the comments, the link.
I put in the private chat, I put in the ABI toolkit, which is a Canadian, but really it's a Canadian website, but really great if you want to do a 5-minute, quick look, or you want to go deeper. And they have a side for victims and a side for professionals. I put up a task force, which is some of the slide decks I've been talking about, and then I put up our support groups, and then I put up the Ohio domestic violence network. Do you have a link you want me to put up?
I don't think so. I know that Paul and Karen have another site that they recently, it's a modification for the cat that was online.
Oh, I can do that. The cat one, yeah.
So you could put that one up too. In terms of, one of the things that someone was saying, if like how to help yourself if you think you're having some problems, you can really go. It doesn't have to be specific to partner violence. If you just go to any sort of TBI, well, I don't know about any, but there are a number of TBI websites that you may go to, and they may give you hints or tips, like, and they'll just list it out. It's all the same. It just basically includes, like, knowing, identifying what bothers you, and then if lights are one thing, you dim the lights, or making sure you bring a pen with you and a piece of paper everywhere so you can write things down so you don't forget it. Make sure you have short meetings, like Katherine was saying earlier. Make sure that people know that they may, if you're working with somebody, make sure they've gotten the information. Don't assume that just because you said it, they actually took in the information.
Mhm.
So there's a whole list of things that are very general to dealing with somebody who may have sustained a traumatic brain injury that may be that could certainly be applicable to anyone here who is reporting some type of symptom.
And it might be safer to have a workbook or a book about ADHD strategies in the house if you're still in that situation where you don't want to bring in a flyer that says domestic violence. We don't have a domestic violence support group per se, and we've been asked to do one before, but I just can't guarantee on Facebook people's safety. Somebody can put up a fake profile. I accept everybody and look at their profile, but to put women aside in an open, a private but not secure forum makes me nervous. But you can get it. There are workbooks on ADD. There are workbooks on strategy for distraction, and these are all the same strategies that are used with brain injury. So that might be a safe way to reach out and have some resources around to help you that won't trigger the person that you're with, that you're looking down a brain injury.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That is, it's great that you mentioned that, because I always like to try to give people ideas, because if someone's still a victim, and we know during COVID, so many people are still trapped, in households with their abuser, that, and haven't been able to get help yet. It's so important for us to give ideas and suggestions, because somehow, some way, they may reach out to someone that may have heard this information and can give these suggestions. So I appreciate you bringing that up. It's so important. And I always try to look at that from that perspective, because as a victim myself, who I did that before I left, I did so much research on different topics online at work, because I had a work computer that my abuser could not view. And so that's what I did. I went online, I went to domestic violence information. So if someone happens to come across this interview that we're doing, I think those tips are incredibly powerful in terms of keeping people safe. So thank you for bringing that up. And both of you guys are still involved in current research. And Katherine, you also, on your site, there is information about the brain bank, where victims and survivors can donate their brains for study. And I know I've talked to a few already, including me, who will be donating. I know I need to get that paperwork filled out, but any other research studies or opportunities for victims, survivors right now? I know we're working on hopefully one in this area soon. It's a work in progress. I don't want to say too much, but we're working on it. But current things going on that you guys think that if anyone would be interested, how they could find out more?
We have several brain banks that we work on. We have one in Canada. We have two in America, and actually, I'm going in on Friday to Mount Sinai, and Kristen Gams O'Connor needs somebody to MRI their brain, so I'm going to go in and get an MRI on Friday, help a friend out, and with her study, you can sign up, and if you're in the New York area, you can go in for a free MRI and free blood work, which I will be photographing myself doing this week, Friday. They're just different studies out there. We work with, in the UK and Northern Ireland, we work with the Glasgow Brain Bank. We were supposed to be having a great big event in London and Australia this year, but postponed to COVID. So my hope is to string together brain injury brain banks across the world. And in most brain banks for brain injury, it's 3 to 4% are female brains. just, literally one or two on the shelf. So, which is not true in Alzheimer's brain banks and some of the other ones. Yeah, so it's I think it's cool to be a part of research. Who needs your brain in the post life?
Absolutely. I mean, you could be contributing to change.
Mm-hmm.
And helping other people in the future by doing so. So I totally agree. Eve, was there anything you were going to add?
I have a virtual, well, because of COVID, I have a virtual study. It's not really the study I had absolutely planned, but we're doing as much as we can. So there's one virtual study, which is nice because then there's not really a geographical limitation so much. And there we're basically trying to get a sense for just trying to get more numbers on how frequently brain injury occurs and how it may be related to different psychological difficulties or cognitive difficulties. So doing some of that work again, and then we also have an in-person study that's using imaging, a number of different imaging modalities, and we're going to get blood-based biomarkers and an objective measure of stress from hair cortisol. So there's two studies. I mean, I guess I sort of call them two studies that are currently ongoing. And if I haven't given you the information for those, I can re-give them.
I was just going to say, I've actually, so on the Enough Initiative page, it's been a little while since I've shared them, so I will reshare the information now that we've had this conversation. So people are maybe starting to realize that, yes, they have sustained brain injury who didn't realize before that they had, and they're interested in being involved in this project. I will reshare the information on the Enough Initiative and my personal page. So that people have it and they have a way to reach out to you and get involved in that research. Anything else you guys want to add that we didn't cover that you feel is important or that we missed in the conversation, or any last questions from anyone watching? Feel free to post.
I just think that from women that I've worked with over the last 10 years, just having somebody else like you, whether you feel comfortable in a private Facebook group or you can connect through a doctor, just having someone. And I think over the centuries, women have shared medical information and life information in circles. That image of women in a sewing circle. I think women didn't really like sewing at all, but they gathered together in a circle. And I think that's very hard in COVID right now. But if you can reach out and find somebody that may not know the answers, but just have that sisterhood with somebody, I really think that's crucial to try to break the isolation.
I mean,
Absolutely.
I mean, part of it is really having people recognize that they're not alone. I mean, 1 in 3 women report some type of physical or sexual violence. So it's just an outrageous number, and people don't necessarily want to admit to it for a whole host of reasons. And unfortunately, that perpetuates sort of the silence of, basically two things: the invisible nature of domestic violence or intimate partner violence, and then these invisible injuries that many women are sustaining. So I try to encourage people to get more comfortable talking about partner violence and have it be more of a, just a check-in thing. And especially during COVID, one of the things that I've been trying to encourage people to do is say, so it's not it's not sort of like you're saying, oh, I think you have a problem. You could just say, oh, COVID has increased the rates of violence in homes globally. And so I just want to check in. Are you doing okay? Because we also know that people don't necessarily want to talk about it. You just let people know that you're there for them. You don't have to, you don't have to say, you don't have to tell me, just, I'm here for you if you need anything. And maybe that, maybe someone will be like, okay, yeah, I actually am having a problem. We could save someone's life. I don't know, but I think we shouldn't be so. I mean, I don't want us as a community, as women, as anybody, to be uncomfortable talking about partner violence. And I think it's partly because we think it's partly our fault, or it will be shamed, or it's embarrassing, or now we're broken. But 1 in 3 women are experiencing this. So what does that tell you? I mean,
Yeah,
it's not uncommon.
absolutely.
Moms,
You're one of many, one of many. And we also do have victim advocates that watch, therapists who are working, attorneys who are working with victims of domestic violence. And, is there anything that you think it's important for them to know? Shelter directors, in terms of maybe starting to look at their protocol, their intake procedures, and looking at brain injury. Any suggestions or recommendations for them?
I think everyone should consider the possibility of a
I
brain injury. Oops, sorry. You can go. I think we're slightly off, so I'm waiting for you to go, and then when you don't go, I go.
Okay.
I put up the training program that it's a CATA Online Women's Support Worker course. And then I also just put up the link for Brain Injury Professional, which Eve has a great
Awesome.
article in, and that's a free. All of this stuff is free, downloadable. I mean, if you just looked at 3 of these 5 sites, you're going to be up there with the most educated. It doesn't take a lot to push yourself to the head of the class with this stuff because it's out there. And I just got an email that Brain Injury Association of America said Domestic Violence Month. I mean, I think if there's one positive side of COVID, it's that domestic violence has a new spotlight as worldwide, across the board. It's not associated with a celebrity or one event or one horror show. It's a systemic problem across our world.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to go ahead. I will post. Thank you for sharing all of that information, those links, because it's great information, and resources for anyone watching. So I will definitely I'm kind of copying and pasting them in, but it's, the more information, the better, for everyone. And I'm hoping that, people watching that are in those positions and those roles will look at things differently and start to ask more screening questions about brain injury, because as we mentioned, for a victim survivor, being able to understand that there is a physiological component if there is a brain injury, and that they can do things about it, like find these accommodations, put these things into practice, for themselves, which I do all the time. And COVID and being at the Zoom world has taught me a lot about the way my brain works, and that I am a very visual. I have to learn through vision and doing. So I have to see something and do it. If you just show me something, like, I'm not, it's not processing and I'm not taking away. So I've learned that, and I've learned now as my accommodation to explain it to my coworkers and my team at my day job, and say to them, can you not just show me the video? Can you actually walk through it with me on screen? Otherwise, so it's powerful though, because then now I can perform my job better because I know what accommodation works for me, and I can ask my team for that. And it's been very powerful. Otherwise, I'd kind of probably just get lost in the shuffle. So all of this is empowering information, and anything we can do to empower victims and survivors to be able to function better after, leaving is incredibly powerful. So I'm so thankful to both of you for being here with us, giving us all this amazing information, these resources, and also continuing to do this research, because again, when I found out you guys were doing it, from Nicole Fisher, I was just so excited, because I was like feeling like, oh, no one cares, about us, this, the population of domestic violence victims. And to hear that you guys do care was incredibly powerful. So thank you for caring everything you're doing. It's absolutely amazing.
A shout out to Nicole. Nicole wrote a great article that included Eve, myself, and a couple other people in our task force in Forbes magazine. I can't tell you how many hits we had. It's a bad pun in that way, but how many people found us through Forbes. I mean, who would have thought Forbes mag? And that's, I think, one of the power that Nicole Fisher has, and follow her on Twitter, is that she has this corporate business health connection to be able to get those stories out, where someone in Forbes is flipping through and doesn't expect to see something on domestic violence. So big fan of Nicole.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, and, I know she is interested in this topic with domestic violence. And because we've talked about it and hopefully she can help us push some more through like she did with that article. That would be great. Because you're right. It's a bigger platform and it catches people's interest in a way that us sharing information or articles isn't going to capture quite the same audience. So it's great to have people on the team involved in those roles. All
Well,
right.
thank you for what you do, rock star.
Thank you. We're trying. We're pushing. We're pushing. We're gonna make things happen because and one of the reasons that we decided to do these lives is the media is so focused right now on COVID and the elections. It's like no other topics seem to really be able to capture their attention. So I'm like, well, if they're not going to talk about this stuff, we are going to talk about this stuff. And we're going to keep, getting the information out there to people. We're not going to let that stop us. So I appreciate you guys a lot. And anyone watching, we'll post more of the links so that you can continue to read up on this topic, find information, resources for yourself, know what questions to ask your healthcare provider, so that you can, get the help you need if you feel like this is something that you've been affected by. So thank you guys, and I'm sure I will talk to you soon. We've had a lot of thank yous in the comments. Oh, okay. Rockstar. Thanks, Miriam. She's on our board of directors. That's so sweet. Thank you, Miriam. All right, guys. I'm gonna broadcast now, and if you guys want to hang out for just a second, I will be right there. Thanks everyone for watching.
Thanks for having us on.
Thank you.